The man showed up on a Friday evening in October of 1998, walking up the gravel driveway of Owen Shepard's farm outside Brookston, Indiana, with a broken fan belt in one hand and nothing else. His name was Arthur Dees. He was 62 years old. His farm was 11 miles north. His Massey Ferguson 3070 had thrown the belt on the county road an hour earlier, and he had walked the last mile and a half to the nearest farm with lights on, which happened to be Owen's. Owen was 41 years old. He had been farming his family's 480 acres since his father's stroke in 1991. He did not know Arthur Dees well. They had spoken maybe 4 times at the elevator over the years, the kind of brief conversations that happen between farmers who are aware of each other without being close. Arthur farmed 620 acres to the north. He was known, loosely, as a serious operator who kept to himself and maintained his equipment carefully and did not ask for things he didn't need. He was asking now. He stood in the driveway holding the broken belt and said he was sorry to come unannounced and that he needed a fan belt for a Massey Ferguson 3070 if Owen happened to have one, and if not, a phone to call his son. Owen said, "Come in the shed." He had 3 fan belts that might fit. He kept a stock of common belts because the nearest parts store was 22 miles away, and a breakdown during planting or harvest could not wait for a 22-mile round trip. He tried the first belt. Too short. He tried the second. It fit. He gave it to Arthur without being asked what it was worth. Arthur said, "What do I owe you?" Owen said, "Nothing. It's a belt." Arthur said, "It's not nothing. What do I owe you?" Owen said, "Come back with your tractor and we'll put it on together. That's what you owe me." Arthur drove his truck back to the county road, retrieved his tractor, and returned to Owen's shed. They put the belt on in 40 minutes. Arthur started the engine. It ran. He thanked Owen again and offered again to pay. Owen said again that there was nothing to pay. Arthur nodded. He drove home. Owen went inside and finished his dinner. He did not think of it as a significant evening. He had given a neighbor a belt that cost him $4.40. That was the entirety of what he had done. He did not know that Arthur Dees had been watching. Not watching that evening specifically. Watching for years. Arthur Dees had been farming in White County since 1963. 35 years. He had seen farmers come and go, seen operations expand and collapse, seen the farm crisis of the 1980s take neighbors he had known since childhood and leave their land in the hands of banks and corporate buyers, and the particular silence that follows when a family farm stops being a family farm. He had developed, across 35 years, a specific sense for the character of farming operations. Not based on acreage or equipment or yield reports, those numbers were available to anyone who paid attention, but based on the smaller things. How a man maintained his fences, whether the equipment coming out of the shed in the morning was greased or not, whether a farmer who was asked for something gave it without making the asking cost more than it should. He had seen both kinds of farmers. The ones who made the asking cost, who tracked favors as debts, who measured every transaction in the specific currency of what they had given versus what they would eventually receive. Those farmers built operations that ran on a kind of bilateral accounting that required constant maintenance. Every favor recorded, every debt called eventually, the community reduced to a ledger that nobody enjoyed keeping but everyone felt obligated to maintain. And then there were the others. The ones who gave the belt without calculating what it was worth, who fixed the fence along the shared line without sending a bill, who showed up in September when a neighbor needed an extra set of hands and did not mention it in October when they needed something themselves. Those farmers built a different kind of community, one that did not run on ledgers because the transactions were not the point. The point was the neighbor. The point was the farm next door still being there 20 years from now, because the people around it had treated it as something worth supporting. Arthur had been watching Owen Shepard for 7 years, since Owen had taken over the farm after his father's stroke. What he had seen was consistent. Owen maintained his equipment correctly. He kept his fences. He paid his bills at the elevator and the co-op without dispute. He planted on time and harvested clean and did not leave grain in the field when he was tired and the day was long. He was, in Arthur D's assessment, the kind of farmer who would still be farming in 20 years when other operations around him had sold or failed. The belt confirmed it. Not because giving away a $4 belt was a remarkable act of generosity. It wasn't. But because of how Owen had handled the asking. Arthur had been prepared to be made to feel the weight of the request. He had walked up a stranger's driveway at dusk with a broken machine and an empty wallet, and he had known, from 35 years of experience, that the reception could go several ways, and that some of them would cost him something beyond the belt. Owen had not made it cost anything. He had said, "Come in the shed," and tried the belts, and given the one that fit, and proposed the arrangement. "Come back with the tractor, we'll put it on together." That transformed the favor into a shared task, which is the specific way that a man of Owen's type handles a favor. He does not make the person receiving it feel the weight of obligation. He distributes the obligation across a task that both people can participate in, and the task becomes the thing, and the favor disappears inside it. Arthur Dees drove home that night and told his wife Margaret what had happened. Margaret said Owen Shepherd seemed like a decent man. Arthur said he'd been watching him for 7 years, and decent was the right word, and also not quite sufficient. Margaret asked what he meant. Arthur said he meant that Owen was going to need something someday, and that when he did, Arthur intended to remember the belt. Margaret said, "That seems proportionate." Arthur said it wasn't about proportion. It was about the kind of farming community that existed when people operated that way, and the kind that existed when they didn't, and which one he intended to contribute to. Margaret said she understood. She had been married to Arthur for 40 years. She usually understood. Arthur Dees farmed his 620 acres through the late 1990s and into the 2000s with the focused discipline of a man who has been doing something correctly for a long time and sees no reason to change the approach that made it correct. He maintained his Massey Ferguson fleet, 3 tractors and a combine, all of them older, all of them in better condition than their age suggested, because Arthur maintained them the way he maintained everything, with attention and without shortcuts. He had no equipment debt. He had no land debt. The last of it had been paid in 1994. His operation was, by the measures that matter to a farmer who has survived 3 decades of agricultural economics, solid. Not large, not flashy, solid. In 2004, his son Robert came back to farm with him. Robert was 34, had spent 10 years working in agricultural equipment sales in Indianapolis, and had come home because his father was 68 and the farm was there, and Robert had understood somewhere in his mid-30s that the farm was the thing that mattered, and that it would not wait indefinitely for him to arrive at that understanding. Robert had opinions about the equipment. He thought his father's Massey Ferguson fleet was too old, and that the maintenance costs were approaching the point where replacement would be more economical than continued repair. He said this once, carefully, in the way that a son who respects his father says something he expects to be disagreed with. Arthur listened to the full argument. Then he said, "The fleet is paid for, and it runs. Show me the numbers where replacement pencils out, and we'll talk." Robert showed him the numbers 3 weeks later. They did not pencil out. The capital cost of replacement, even with used equipment, exceeded the projected maintenance savings over any reasonable planning horizon. Arthur looked at the numbers and said, "Good. Now you know why we maintain what we have." Robert said, "I know why. I just wanted to make sure you knew I'd looked." Arthur said, "I know you looked. That's why I gave you time to do it." The Massey Ferguson fleet continued. Robert learned to maintain it the way Arthur maintained it, by the service manual, by the hour meter, by the specific sounds and feel that a machine communicates to a person who is paying attention. By 2007, Robert could diagnose a hydraulic problem from the sound of the pump the way Arthur could. By 2009, he was doing the annual engine inspections without supervision. Owen Shepherd had not thought about the belt since the evening he gave it. It had been a $4 belt and 40 minutes and a repair done in a shed on a Friday night, and it had left his mind completely by the following Monday, replaced by the 1,000 other things that a farming operation in October requires of the man running it. He was aware, in the general way that farmers are aware of their neighbors, that Arthur Dees was doing well. The fields to the north were always clean, the equipment always looked maintained, the grain always came off on time. These things were visible from the road, and Owen noticed them the way he noticed everything about his operating environment, not with particular attention, just with the steady awareness of a man who is always reading the landscape around him for information. In 2006, Owen had a difficult year. A wet spring delayed planting by 11 days. A dry August reduced his corn yield by 22% below projection. A hydraulic cylinder on his primary tractor failed during harvest. A catastrophic failure, the rod bending under load in a way that took the machine out of service for 4 days while he sourced parts from a dealer in Lafayette and waited for delivery and installed them himself because the dealer's service bay was backed up and he could not afford to wait. He managed. The farm survived 2006 the way it survived difficult years, through the specific financial resilience of an operation that carried no excess debt and had reserves adequate for bad weather and equipment failure. But the 4 lost harvest days had cost him yield, and the hydraulic repair had cost him money he hadn't planned to spend, and the 11-day planting delay had set the whole season back in ways that compounded through to November. He did not mention any of this to Arthur Dees. He did not mention it to anyone except his wife Linda, who kept the books and already knew. He did not know that Arthur Dees knew anyway, not the details. But Arthur could read a season from the outside with 35 years of practice, and he could read an operation, and he had been reading Owens for 13 years, and he could see the shape of what 2006 had been. Arthur called Owen in November of 2006. He said he'd had a reasonable year, and he wanted to know if Owen needed anything going into the winter. Owen said no. He was managing. Arthur said he understood and that the offer was open and to call if that changed. Owen thanked him and said he would and didn't call. Arthur expected that. He hadn't called expecting Owen to accept. He had called because Owen was the kind of farmer who would not accept help he didn't strictly need. And Arthur respected that. And offering was the right thing to do, regardless of whether accepting was likely. He filed the conversation in the same part of his accounting where he had filed the belt in 1998. In the spring of 2011, Arthur Dees was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. He was 75 years old. The diagnosis came at the end of a winter when he had noticed tremors in his right hand that he had initially attributed to cold and then to age, and finally, reluctantly, to something that required a doctor's opinion. The doctor's opinion was unambiguous. The disease was in its early stages. The progression would be manageable for a period, and then it would not be. Arthur told Robert, he told Margaret, he told no one else for 3 months. In those 3 months, he did 2 things. He continued farming. It was spring, the ground was ready, and the Massey Ferguson fleet needed to be in the fields, and it was in the fields, and he made decisions about what came after. The farm would go to Robert. That had always been the plan, and Parkinson's did not change the plan. What it changed was the timeline and the structure. Arthur needed to transfer operational control to Robert in a way that was gradual enough for Robert to absorb it fully and rapid enough to be completed before the disease made the transfer involuntary. He began that process in the summer of 2011, deliberately, without drama, handing off decisions one by one in the way that a skilled operator hands off a machine. Not all at once, but progressively, letting the new operator develop confidence before the handoff is complete. Robert absorbed it correctly. By the fall of 2012, he was running the operation. Arthur was present, visible, available for consultation. But the decisions were Robert's, and everyone who dealt with the farm understood that. In the summer of 2013, Arthur's condition became more visible. The tremor in his right hand was apparent. His gait had changed. He drove the farm roads in his truck, but did not operate equipment. He sat in the shed in the mornings while Robert and his hired man prepared the machines for the day, and he watched the preparation with the specific attention of a man who has done something for 50 years and can no longer do it but still understands it completely. He thought about Owen Shepherd during those mornings, He thought about the belt in 1998. He thought about the November call in 2006. He thought about what he had told Margaret, that it wasn't about proportion. It was about the kind of farming community that existed when people operated a certain way. He called Robert into the shed one morning in August of 2013 and told him what he wanted to do. Robert listened. Then he said, "All of them?" Arthur said, "All of them." Robert said, "Dad, I know what it is. It's what I want to do with what I've built. Are you going to tell me I can't?" Said, "No, I'm going to help you do it." Owen Shepherd was in his equipment shed on a Tuesday morning in September of 2013 when he heard the first truck turn into his driveway. He walked to the shed door and looked out. It was a flatbed carrying a Massey Ferguson tractor. He did not recognize the truck. He walked to the driveway. The driver got out and said he had a delivery for Owen Shepherd from Arthur Dees. Owen said he wasn't expecting a delivery. The driver said he understood that and that he had paperwork if Owen wanted to see it. The paperwork was a transfer of title. One Massey Ferguson tractor, Owen's name on the receiving line. At the bottom, a note in handwriting that shook slightly at the edges of the letters. "Owen, you gave me a belt in 1998 and wouldn't take anything for it. I've been meaning to settle that account. This is a start." "Arthur," Owen read the note. He looked at the tractor on the flatbed. He looked at the driver. He said, "A start?" The driver said, "There are more coming." Owen stood in his driveway while the driver unloaded the first tractor. Then the second truck arrived. Then the third. Through the morning and into the afternoon, flatbeds came up his driveway carrying Massey Ferguson equipment, tractors of various models and years, a combine, planters, tillage equipment, each with a transfer of title, each with Owen's name, each with the same note or a variation of it in Arthur's shaking handwriting. By the end of the day, 100 pieces of Massey Ferguson equipment were parked in Owen Shepherd's fields and his lot and along his driveway. The inventory that Arthur Dees had accumulated across 50 years of careful farming and careful buying and careful maintenance, every machine paid for, every machine maintained to the standard Arthur had applied to everything, was now Owen Shepherd's. Owen called Arthur that evening. Arthur answered on the third ring. Owen said, "Arthur, what did you do?" Arthur said, "I settled a debt." Owen said, "A fan belt." It was a fan belt. Arthur said, "It wasn't the belt, Owen. It was how you handled the asking. I've been watching farming communities my whole life, and I know what they look like when people handle things the way you handled that Friday night, and I know what they look like when they don't. I built something across 50 years in this county. I want it to stay in hands that handle things the right way. Your hands are the right hands." Owen was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I don't know what to say to that." Arthur said, "You don't have to say anything. Just farm them right." Owen said, "I will." Arthur said, "I know. That's why they're there." Arthur Dees died in February of 2017. He was 81 years old. He had farmed for 54 years. His obituary in the Monticello paper ran 4 paragraphs and listed his survivors and noted that he had been a lifelong farmer in White County. It did not mention the 100 machines he had given away in September of 2013. It did not mention Owen Shepherd. It mentioned that Arthur was known for his careful stewardship of the land he farmed and the people he farmed among. Robert Dees attended the service and spoke briefly. He said his father had believed that a farming community was built from the accumulation of small decisions made correctly across years, that the character of a county's agriculture was not determined by its largest operations, but by the daily choices of the people running the smallest ones. He said his father had spent his whole life trying to make the right small decisions and had trusted that they added up to something. Owen Shepherd sat in the third row. He did not speak. After the service, he shook Robert's hand and said he was sorry. Robert said he was glad his father had known Owen. Owen said he was glad too, although he was not sure he had earned the distinction. Robert said, "My father was not a man who gave things to people who hadn't earned them. If he thought you'd earned it, you'd earned it." Owen drove home. He pulled into his driveway past equipment that had not been there 4 years earlier. The Massey Ferguson fleet that Arthur had assembled across 5 decades and maintained to a standard that showed in the condition of every machine. He pulled into his shed and sat in his truck for a moment. He thought about October of 1998. The man walking up the driveway at dusk with a broken belt and an apology for coming unannounced. The second belt that fit, the 40 minutes in the shed, the $4 he had not taken. He had not been doing Arthur a favor that evening. He had simply been doing what the situation required. A neighbor needed a belt, and Owen had one, and giving it was the obvious and ordinary thing to do. He had not thought about it afterward. He had not expected it to be remembered. Arthur had remembered it for 15 years. Owen got out of his truck and walked through the shed. The Massey Ferguson equipment was maintained and running and ready for the season. He had farmed it carefully since September of 2013, the way Arthur had asked him to, the way he would have farmed any equipment he was responsible for. He kept the service logs. He maintained the schedules. He knew each machine by its hours and its history and its particular mechanical character, because that was how you maintained equipment and how you honored the person who had maintained it before you. He picked up his grease gun and started his morning rounds. Outside, the fields that Arthur Dees had watched for 15 years were waiting for another season. The Massey Ferguson fleet that had crossed those fields across 5 decades was ready to cross them again. And the community that Arthur had believed in, the one built from small decisions made correctly, from belts given without conditions and debts settled without expectation, was still there in the gravel driveway and the shed and the 40 minutes on a Friday evening in 1998 that had started something neither man had planned, and both of them, in their different ways, had honored. The grease gun made its rounds. The morning came on. The work continued. It always did. The price dropped 3 times before anyone raised a hand. It was a Thursday morning in March of 2001, and the auctioneer was standing beside a Massey Ferguson 3090 that had been sitting at the back of a dispersal sale in Benton County, Indiana, for 2 hours without attracting serious interest. The machine had been brought in last, after the combines and the planter and the newer tractors, in the way that auctioneers bring in the difficult lots. At the end, when the crowd is tired and the serious money has already been spent, and the people still standing are the ones who came to pick up something cheap or go home with nothing. The opening bid was $8,000. Silence. The auctioneer dropped to 6. A man near the fence offered 5. The auctioneer worked the crowd for a competing bid. Nothing. He dropped to 4,500. Still nothing. 4,000. The man near the fence shook his head and walked away. $3,200. From the back of the crowd, a hand went up. The hand belonged to a 38-year-old farmer named Daniel Pruitt. He had 360 acres of corn and soybean ground in Warren County, a farm he had been working alone since his wife Carol took a teaching position in Williamsport that kept her in town 5 days a week. He had come to the sale looking for a tillage tractor, something to pull his chisel plow and his field cultivator without putting strain on his primary machine, which was a 1998 Massey Ferguson 6180 that he'd bought used 2 years earlier and was already carrying more hours than he was comfortable with for a tractor that had no backup behind it. He had not planned to spend more than $4,000. $3,200 was under budget. He raised his hand, the auctioneer pointed, and nobody else moved. Sold. Daniel walked to the cashier's table and wrote the check. He borrowed a trailer from the man next to him in line, a farmer he'd met twice at the elevator who happened to be going back toward Warren County, and said Daniel was welcome to hitch behind his truck. They loaded the Massey Ferguson, drove south, and Daniel unloaded it in his machine shed in the late afternoon. He stood in the shed looking at what he'd bought. The machine was a 1988 model with the hour meter showing 9,400. The paint was weathered down to primer in places. The cab had a crack in the left window that had been taped from the inside with electrical tape. One hydraulic hose was wrapped in duct tape over what appeared to be a previous leak repair. The previous owner, a farmer named Howard Kessel, who had been selling everything after his wife's illness, forced the family to move closer to Indianapolis, had described the tractor at the auction as needing work without specifying what work. Daniel understood. He had bought needing work before. He knew what it meant. It meant the machine ran, or had recently run, but had problems that the seller either couldn't diagnose correctly, couldn't afford to fix, or didn't want to disclose in detail in a public auction setting. It meant the buyer was purchasing uncertainty alongside the machine, and the price was supposed to compensate for the uncertainty. $3,200 was adequate compensation, in Daniel's view, for whatever needing work turned out to mean. He had the tools and the knowledge and the time to find out. He would find out on Saturday, when the week's field work was done and the shed was available for the kind of focused inspection that a machine with an unknown history required. He went inside. He did not know what Saturday would find. Daniel Pruitt had grown up around equipment the way farm children grow up around it, by proximity, by necessity, by the specific education that comes from watching a problem get solved and then solving it yourself the next time it appears. His father had farmed 600 acres in Fountain County and had maintained his own equipment because the alternative was dependency on a dealership that was 40 minutes away and not always available when availability was required. By the time Daniel took over his own farm in 1990, he could rebuild a hydraulic pump, diagnose an injection system problem from the exhaust characteristics, and read a diesel engine's condition from the oil on the dipstick with the specific literacy of someone who has been reading dipsticks since he was 12. He was not a trained mechanic. He was something more specific than that. A farmer who understood his machines the way a farmer understands his fields, through accumulated observation that no classroom could have produced. The Massey Ferguson 3090 sat in his shed through the week. On Saturday morning, Daniel was in the shed at 6 o'clock with his toolbox and his service manual and a pad of paper for notes. He started with the basics: oil level, coolant, hydraulic fluid, fuel filters. Everything looked older than it should have, but cleaner than the machine's general appearance suggested. The oil was dark but not contaminated. The coolant was recent. The hydraulic fluid had been changed within the last year, based on its color and clarity. He started the engine. It turned over on the second crank, which was better than he had expected from a machine that had been sitting in a sale lot for who knew how long. It ran rough for 30 seconds. He let it warm. The roughness diminished but did not entirely disappear. There was a slight irregularity in the idle that suggested something in the fuel system. Possibly an injector, possibly the pump itself. He let it run for 20 minutes and listened. The irregularity was consistent. It was not getting worse. He checked the exhaust, slight blue tinge, not heavy, not the black smoke of a seriously worn engine. He checked the gauges. Oil pressure was good, temperature was normal. He shut it down. Then he did what he always did with an unknown machine. He went under the hood and started looking at everything he could see, without disassembling anything. He was looking at the injection pump bracket when he noticed the envelope. It was tucked between the injection pump and the firewall, held in place by the pump bracket itself, as if someone had slipped it there deliberately, and then the bracket had been reinstalled over it, pinning it without crushing it. The envelope was yellowed and slightly greasy from proximity to the engine, but intact. Daniel worked it free carefully. His name was not on it. Nothing was on it. He opened it. Inside were 11 pages of folded paper, service records, parts receipts, and a single handwritten note on ruled paper. Daniel unfolded everything and spread it on the hood of the tractor and read it in the morning light coming through the shed door. The service records were from a Massey Ferguson dealer in Covington, dated between April of 1997 and November of 1999. They documented a complete engine rebuild. New pistons, new rings, new main bearings, new rod bearings, a rebuilt cylinder head, new injectors, a rebuilt injection pump, a new turbocharger. The total on the receipts came to $16,340. The handwritten note was from Howard Kessel. It said, "Whoever gets this tractor, I rebuilt this engine in 1997 because I thought I was going to farm it for another 20 years. I didn't get to. The engine has less than 2,000 hours on it since the rebuild. I didn't tell the auctioneer because I didn't want to get into it. The records are real. The dealer is Watsika Implement in Covington. You can call them and verify. Take care of it. It deserves it." Daniel read the note twice. Then he read the service records twice. Then he stood beside the Massey Ferguson 3090 in the early morning light and understood what he had bought. He called Watsika Implement on Monday morning. He asked for the service department. He gave them the tractor's serial number and asked if they had records of a rebuild in 1997. The service manager put him on hold for 4 minutes. When he came back, he confirmed the records. The rebuild had been done in their shop. The parts were genuine Massey Ferguson components. The work had been performed by their senior mechanic who had been with the dealership for 19 years. The total was $16,340, paid by Howard Kessel in 2 installments. Daniel thanked the service manager and hung up. He sat at his kitchen table for a while. Then he called Carol at the school where she taught. He told her what he'd found. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So you paid $3,200 for a machine with a $16,000 engine in it?" Daniel said, "That's about right." Carol said, "And nobody at the auction knew." Daniel said, "Howard Kessel knew." He put the records in an envelope and tucked them behind the injection pump bracket. Carol said, "Why didn't he just tell the auctioneer?" Daniel said he'd been thinking about that. He said, "I think Howard didn't want to watch that machine get bid up by people who were only interested in what it was worth on paper. I think he wanted it to go to someone who would find the records after they'd already committed to the machine. Someone who bought it for the right reasons, even before they knew what was inside it." Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's a strange way to think about selling a tractor." Daniel said, "I think Howard was a strange way of thinking about farming. He meant it as a compliment. It was the highest compliment Daniel Pruitt knew how to pay." The irregularity in the idle turned out to be a single injector that was slightly out of calibration. Not failing, not worn, just drifted from specification the way injectors drift over time and use. Daniel had it recalibrated at a shop in Attica for $80. After the recalibration, the engine ran clean. The idle was smooth. There was no blue smoke, no roughness, no hesitation under load. He put the tractor to work in the spring of 2001. It pulled his 12-foot chisel plow through ground that had been wet all winter and was slow to dry. Four-wheel drive engaging cleanly in the corners where the field drained poorly and the soil stayed soft longer than the rest. He finished spring tillage 5 days ahead of schedule, which meant 5 days earlier into planting, which meant 5 days of the planting window that his primary tractor hadn't burned on secondary work. The Massey Ferguson 3090 paid for itself in that first spring. Not literally, $3,200 and an $80 injector calibration against 5 days of recovered planning time is not a calculation that reduces to a clean number. But in the way that the right piece of equipment pays for itself, by doing the work it was purchased to do, without requiring the attention and expense and downtime that the wrong piece of equipment extracts across the seasons. He kept the envelope. He put it in the filing cabinet in his farm office, in the folder where he kept equipment documentation. He told 2 people about it. Carol, on the phone the day he called the dealer, and his neighbor, Jim Alcott, who came to the shed one evening in April to look at a hydraulic fitting on his own machine and asked about the 3090. Daniel told him the story. Jim listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When Daniel finished, Jim said, "You think Howard Kessel did that on purpose? Hid the records so whoever got it would have to earn them first?" Daniel said, "I don't think Howard thought about it in those terms. I think Howard was a man who rebuilt an engine because the work deserved to be done right, and then had to sell everything and felt bad about the machine going cheap and wanted whoever got it to understand what they had." Jim said, "And you do understand what you have?" Daniel said, "I'm starting to." The years that followed were the years of an operation finding its level. Daniel farmed his 360 acres carefully, expanded to 440 in 2004, when a parcel adjacent to his north field came available at a price that his accounting said was right, and managed the operation with the specific discipline of a man who has learned that the margin between a farm that survives and a farm that doesn't is thinner than most people outside farming understand. The Massey Ferguson 3090 was in the field every season. Spring tillage, fall chisel work, pulling wagons during harvest when his combine was moving faster than his primary tractor could keep up. It accumulated hours on the rebuilt engine. Not quickly, because a tillage tractor on a 400-acre operation doesn't run the hours that a primary machine runs, but steadily. By 2005, the engine had 3,500 hours on it since the rebuild. By 2008, 4,800. Daniel maintained it the way the receipts in the envelope suggested. Howard Kessel had maintained the machine before the rebuild. Oil every 100 hours, filters on schedule, hydraulic fluid changed on the service interval. Nothing deferred because deferring was cheaper in the moment and more expensive across the years. He kept his own service log for the machine and kept it in the same filing cabinet as Howard's envelope, the two documents together forming a continuous record of a machine that had been cared for by two different men across 20 years. In 2007, he replaced the hydraulic hose that had been wrapped in duct tape since the day he bought the machine. He found when he removed the tape that the hose underneath had been patched over a small cut rather than replaced, the kind of repair that holds under normal pressure but is a failure waiting to happen under load. He replaced the hose and noted in his service log, original hose, taped repair, replaced with new. Parts cost $42. He felt better about the machine after that, the way you feel better about a thing when you have addressed the one known uncertainty that was left in it. He did not think often about Howard Kessel, but he thought about him sometimes, in the way that you think about a person whose decision shaped something in your life without either of you having planned it. Howard had rebuilt an engine he couldn't afford to lose and then lost everything else and put the records in an envelope and tucked the envelope behind a bracket and driven the machine to a sale and said nothing. And Daniel had stood in the back of the crowd when the price dropped to $3,200 and raised his hand for a machine he had not inspected and had driven it home and found what Howard had left him. The chain of that, the rebuild, the records, the envelope, the bracket, the auction, the hand, was not planned by anyone. It had assembled itself from the separate decisions of two men who had never met, and it had produced something that neither of them could have designed. A machine, cared for continuously, across two ownerships in 20 years, that was running as well in 2009 as it had run when the dealer in Covington buttoned up the engine in the fall of 1997. Daniel found Howard Kessel in 2009. He had not looked for him. He had been in Indianapolis for a farm equipment conference and had seen the name in a program, Howard Kessel, retired, formerly of Benton County, speaking briefly on a panel about family farm transitions. Daniel waited until after the panel and introduced himself. Howard was 73. He was thin and moved carefully, the way men move when their joints have opinions about distance. He looked at Daniel for a moment when Daniel said his name and then said, "The 3090. Daniel said, "Yes." Howard said, "You found the envelope." Daniel said, "Behind the injection pump bracket." I called Watsika Implement to verify. Howard nodded slowly. He said, "How is it running?" Daniel said, 11 years and it hasn't missed a day of work. I've put 5,000 hours on the rebuilt engine. It runs as clean now as when I bought it." Howard looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "I didn't know what I was going to do with those records. I didn't want to disclose them at the sale because I knew the price would go up and it would end up with someone who was just looking for the value. I wanted it to go to someone who would find out what it was after they'd already decided they wanted it." Daniel said, "I raised my hand at 3,200. I didn't know what was in it." Howard said, "I know. That's why I left the records for you." Daniel said, "You couldn't have known I'd raise my hand." Howard said, "No. But whoever raised their hand last, when the price was at the bottom, was the person I wanted to have it. Someone who saw something in the machine before they knew what it was worth. That's the person who was going to take care of it." Daniel thought about that for a moment. Then he said, "I have your records in my filing cabinet, your handwritten note too." Howard said, "Keep them." Daniel said, "I will." They shook hands. Daniel drove back to Warren County. He went to the shed when he got home and started the Massey Ferguson 3090 and let it idle in the shed for a few minutes, the way he sometimes did when he had been away and wanted to confirm it was still what it had been when he left. It was still what it had been. The engine was smooth, the idle was even. The gauges were where they were supposed to be. He shut it down and put his hand on the hood for a moment, the way you put your hand on something that has earned a kind of respect that the hand understands better than words do. Then he went inside. The Massey Ferguson 3090 is still on Daniel Pruitt's farm. It is 36 years old. The engine that Howard Kessel paid $16,340 to rebuild in 1997 has accumulated nearly 9,000 hours since that work was done. Daniel has never opened it beyond routine maintenance. The injectors were replaced in 2014. The turbocharger was rebuilt in 2017. The injection pump was overhauled in 2019. Everything else is original to the rebuild. Daniel is 61 years old now. His son Matthew farms alongside him, learning the operation the way Daniel learned his father's, by proximity, by necessity, by the specific education of watching a problem get solved and then solving it yourself. Matthew has heard the story of the envelope. He knows what the records say. He keeps the filing cabinet organized the way Daniel taught him. The envelope is still there. Howard's note is still there, yellowed further with the years, the handwriting faded but legible. Whoever gets this tractor, the dealer is Watsika Implement. You can call them and verify. Take care of it. It deserves it. Matthew asked his father once what the lesson of the story was. Daniel said he didn't think of it as a story with a lesson. He thought of it as a record of two decisions. Howard's decision to rebuild the engine when he could have run the machine until it failed, and Daniel's decision to raise his hand at the bottom of the price because the machine looked like something worth the uncertainty. Matthew said, and both decisions turned out to be right. Daniel said, both decisions were right before they turned out to be anything. Howard didn't know he was going to lose the farm when he rebuilt the engine. He rebuilt it because it was the right thing to do with a machine he was responsible for. And I didn't know what was in the envelope when I raised my hand. I raised my hand because the machine looked like it was worth $3,200, even if the answer to needing work was expensive. Matthew said, so the hidden rebuild didn't change anything. Daniel looked at him. He said, it confirmed everything. That's different from changing it. Matthew thought about that for a while. Then he went back to the machine he'd been working on. Daniel watched him go and thought about a Thursday morning in March of 2001, and a price dropping 3 times, and a hand going up in the back of a crowd, and an envelope behind an injection pump bracket. Howard Kessel had been right. The person who raised their hand last was the person who should have had it, and the machine, maintained across 2 ownerships and 24 years, was still proving it every season.